All right, so you ready for a deep dive into educational psychology? Sounds like you want to learn more about how we learn and how that plays out in the classroom. We've got some excerpts from an educational psych text here, and we're going to pull out some of those big ideas so you can actually use what you learn.
It's really incredible to see how much this field has changed over the years. We're going to go back and look at the roots of educational psychology. But we're not going to just list names and dates. We're going to see how all those big thinkers from way back when shaped the way we approach teaching and learning today.
Like, for instance, you've probably heard of John Dewey and that whole learning by doing idea. But have you ever thought about how that translates to like project-based learning or those hands-on activities you see in classrooms? We'll look at how those ideas still have an impact on education even now.
And of course, we can't talk about big names without bringing up Jean Piaget and his theory of cognitive development. What's super important here is understanding that kids don't just learn more as they get older. Their brains actually develop in ways that change how they learn best at different ages.
So if you're working with younger kids, you might focus on concrete activities and hands-on exploration. But as kids get older, you can start to introduce more abstract concepts and really challenge them to think critically.
Now, Piaget really focused on the individual learner, but another important figure, Lev Vygotsky, he emphasized how important social interaction is for learning. You've probably heard of his zone of proximal development, or ZPD for short. But think about it this way. How can you actually use that concept to design activities that encourage students to learn together and collaborate? Maybe you could pair up students with different skill levels so they can learn from each other.
That's a really good point. It's not just about what a student can do on their own. It's also about what they can do with the right kind of support from other people.
Exactly. Vygotsky's theories have had a huge impact on things like scaffolding, where teachers provide temporary support to help students master new skills. And it's also influenced the use of peer tutoring, where students learn by teaching each other.
Okay, so we've talked about some of these big names in educational psychology, and it's pretty clear that their ideas are still relevant today.
Okay.
But let's move beyond the historical context and look at some of the core theories that underpin educational psychology. We're going to talk about behaviorism, cognitivism, and constructivism, not just like definitions, but as actual frameworks for understanding how students learn and how teachers can create effective learning experiences.
And remember, you probably already have some knowledge about these theories, so we're going to kind of skip over the basic definitions and jump right into how they're used in practice.
So let's start with behaviorism. Think about this. How could you use the idea of reinforcement and feedback to shape student behavior in the classroom? What are some of the potential benefits and drawbacks of using reward systems?
We also need to think about the ethical implications. Is it okay to use punishment as a motivator? And how can we use reinforcement in a way that makes students want to learn, not just comply?
Those are really great questions. Let's switch gears a bit and explore cognitivism. It focuses on those mental processes that happen inside our heads. How can teachers tap into how students think, remember, and solve problems to design more effective lessons?
So imagine you're teaching a new concept. How could you structure the lesson to make it easier for students to remember that information? Could you use visual aids, connect the new information to things they already know, or give them chances to practice recalling the information?
Those are all good strategies. And it's not just about memorizing facts. It's about developing critical thinking skills. How can teachers encourage students to analyze information, evaluate evidence, and draw their own conclusions?
And that's where constructivism comes in. It makes us think about how students actively construct their own understanding of the world based on their own experiences. So instead of just lecturing, how can teachers create opportunities for hands-on learning experimentation and project-based activities?
I love that. It's about shifting from passive learning to active learning, letting students take ownership of their own learning.
And it's also about recognizing that learning isn't always a straightforward process. Students don't just soak up information like sponges. They make connections build upon what they already know, and sometimes even change their understanding when they encounter new information.
It's a messy, but really amazing process, isn't it? And we can't forget that learning happens best in a social setting. We already talked about Vygotsky's socio-interactionist theory, but let's dig into some specific ways teachers can foster collaboration and meaningful interactions in the classroom.
So think about this. How can you structure group work so that it's not just about dividing up the work, but about really collaborating and learning from each other? Could you use strategies like pair-share jigsaw activities or even online discussion forums?
That's a really good point. It's about using the power of social interaction to deepen understanding and make the learning environment more engaging.
And remember, these theories aren't mutually exclusive. Effective teachers often draw on elements from all of them to create a learning environment that works for all their students.
So we've covered a lot here, from the history of educational psychology to some of the main theories that shape how we think about teaching and learning. But how does all of this theory actually translate into what happens in the classroom? What's the real-world impact? Let's shift our focus to the practical applications of educational psychology and how it gives teachers the tools they need to create dynamic and effective learning experiences.
So let's explore how these theories can help you as a learner or an educator to design engaging lessons, accommodate different learning styles, and create a classroom where every student feels valued and supported. So one of the biggest things teachers have to figure out is how to create lessons that work for all the different kinds of learners in their classroom.
It's like being a detective almost, right?
Yeah.
You got to figure out what makes each student tick. Visual learners, auditory learners, kinesthetic learners. How do you even begin to address all those different needs?
That's where educational psychology can really come in handy. By understanding the principles behind those different learning styles, teachers can design lessons that incorporate all kinds of activities and approaches. Think about it. You could use visual aids, hands-on activities, group discussions, even technology to create a learning experience that really hits all the senses.
Yeah, it's about giving students different ways to connect with the content so that everyone has a chance to understand it in a way that makes sense to them. I remember struggling with math in school until one teacher started using manipulatives and real-world examples. And it was like suddenly everything clicked.
Exactly. And it's not just about catering to those different learning styles, it's also about figuring out how to get students excited about learning and keep them engaged.
Okay, let's be honest. Not every lesson is going to be super exciting. So how can teachers make even those kind of boring topics come alive for students?
Well, remember those theories we were talking about earlier? They can be really useful here. For example, teachers can use those behaviorism principles, like creating reward systems or using positive reinforcement to encourage participation. But it's really important to find that sweet spot between extrinsic motivation and intrinsic motivation.
So maybe instead of just giving out stickers for completing assignments, teachers could try to make the learning itself more rewarding. Could they incorporate game simulations or project-based activities that tap into students' natural curiosity and that desire to learn?
Exactly. And don't forget how powerful social interaction can be. When students have a chance to collaborate, discuss their ideas, and learn from each other, their engagement levels just shoot up. Think about using cooperative learning activities, peer tutoring, or even just structured class discussions. It helps to create a more interactive and engaging learning environment.
I love that. It's about shifting from that teacher-centered classroom to something more student-centered, where students are actually involved in the learning process. But what about dealing with challenging behaviors in the classroom? Every teacher has to deal with disruptive students or students who are struggling to stay focused. How can educational psychology help teachers navigate those tricky situations?
That's where evidence-based approaches come in. Instead of relying on gut feelings or those old-school methods, teachers can use strategies that have actually been proven to work for addressing specific behaviors.
So it's not about punishing kids or labeling them. It's about understanding why they're behaving that way and finding strategies that will actually help them learn and grow.
Exactly. And it's not a one-size-fits-all solution. Teachers need to really take the time to get to know their students, understand their strengths and challenges, and then come up with individual strategies to support them.
That makes a lot of sense. It's like being a detective, figuring out what makes each student tick, and then adjusting your approach accordingly.
Exactly. And it's important to remember that teachers aren't in this alone. School psychologists are there to support students' social, emotional, and academic well-being. They can help teachers to understand those challenging behaviors, develop strategies, and even provide counseling to students who are struggling.
It's like having a mental health expert right there in the school building, ready to help both students and teachers. But let's talk about assessment for a minute. We often think of tests and grades, but how can teachers use assessment in a more holistic way to really understand their students' needs and how they're progressing?
That's a great question. Assessment is about so much more than just measuring how well a student is doing academically. It's about gathering information from all kinds of sources to really get a complete picture of each student.
So instead of just relying on those standardized tests, teachers could also look at things like observations, portfolios, student self-reflections, and even talk to parents and guardians to get a more well-rounded perspective of a student's strengths, challenges, and learning style.
Exactly. And assessment shouldn't just be about finding out what a student is struggling with. It's also about recognizing and celebrating what they're good at and what they can do. It's about giving feedback that helps them grow and encourages them, helping them see themselves as capable learners.
That's so important. Assessment should be a tool that helps students learn and grow, not just a way to label or rank them. And that brings us to the idea of creating inclusive learning environments. How can teachers create classrooms where every student feels welcome, valued, and respected, no matter their background abilities or challenges?
This is where educational psychology can offer some really important insights. It's about understanding the principles of diversity, equity, and inclusion, and then using those principles in every aspect of the classroom, from the curriculum and the activities to the overall classroom culture.
So it's about more than just having a diverse group of students. It's about making sure that everyone feels like they belong, that their voices are heard, and that they have equal opportunities to learn and succeed.
Exactly. And it's about challenging our own biases and assumptions. We all come to the classroom with our own experiences and perspectives, and it's important to be mindful of how those might affect how we interact with students.
That's really important. We have to be willing to take a step back and look at our own practices and make sure that we're creating an environment that is truly fair and inclusive for everyone.
And creating that kind of inclusive classroom is a journey. It's about constantly learning, reflecting, and making changes to ensure that every student has the chance to thrive.
It's about recognizing that each student is unique and deserves the opportunity to learn and grow to their full potential. Speaking of which, I think it's time we delve a little deeper into the role of school psychologists. We've touched on their work a bit, but I'm really curious to learn more about the specific ways they help both students and teachers.
School psychologists are like the unsung heroes of education. They do so much and play such an important role in making sure that every student has the resources and support they need to be successful.
Let's explore that a bit. What are some of the things that school psychologists do that make such a big difference for students?
One of the most important things they do is assessments to really understand the student's individual needs.
So not just those standardized tests that everyone dreads.
Right. It's about going beyond those test scores and grades to get a more complete picture of the student.
So things like observing the student in the classroom, talking to teachers and parents, even looking at work samples, all to get a sense of their strengths, challenges, and learning style.
Exactly. It's like putting a puzzle together to really understand that student.
And once they have that understanding, they can start to create a plan to support those needs.
Right, and that might mean creating an IEP, an individualized education program for students with disabilities.
So giving them the support and accommodations they need to learn and reach their potential.
Absolutely. But school psychologists do so much more than just testing and IEPs. They're also trained to provide counseling and support.
So if a student is struggling with anxiety or depression, dealing with bullying, family problems, or even just academic stress, they have someone to turn to.
Exactly. School psychologists are like mental health first responders in the school. They provide a safe and supportive space for students to talk about what's going on and learn how to cope.
It's so great that students have access to that kind of support right there in their school.
It really is. And school psychologists don't just work with individual students, they also work with teachers and families to create a more supportive and inclusive environment.
So they might do things like lead workshops for teachers on topics like classroom management or bullying prevention.
Or they might work with parents to help them understand their child's needs and come up with strategies to support them at home.
It sounds like they really are the glue that holds everything together.
They really are. And, one of the things I admire most about school psychologists is their commitment to advocating for all students, especially those who are often marginalized or underserved.
They're true champions for equity and inclusion, making sure that every student has a chance to succeed.
Exactly. They understand that education isn't just about academics, it's about creating an environment where all students can thrive.
This deep dive into the world of educational psychology has been incredible. I feel like I've learned so much about how we learn how to teach and why it all matters.
Me too. It's been fascinating.
And I think one of the key takeaways for me is that educational psychology isn't just theory. It has real-world applications that can truly make a difference in students' lives.
I completely agree. By understanding the principles of educational psychology, we can create learning experiences that are engaging, effective, and truly life-changing.
So as we wrap up this episode, I want to leave you with something to think about. What are you most curious to learn more about in educational psychology? How can you use these insights to improve your own learning or teaching?
And remember, learning is a journey that never ends. Keep exploring, keep asking questions, and keep working to create a world where every student can reach their full potential.
Well said. Until next time, happy learning.